Hey, welcome to the Ed Collab Gatherings workshop number 7. For this session, we're going to be hearing from Rebecca, Barb, Rachel, and Lauren. And what we're going to be hearing about, the paths of inquiry, questioning, and curiosity to support disciplinary learning grades K-12. All right, so take it away, Lauren.
Thank you, Diana, and thank you for all of your help this morning getting us started. We are eternally grateful. Welcome to our session, Paths of Inquiry. Today we're going to talk about research and instructional strategies for supporting literacy in content area classrooms. I'm Lauren Francese. I'm here from Stratford, Connecticut, work in the Westport Public Schools. And I'll introduce Barb and Rebecca. They're broadcasting from Fairfield. And we are thrilled to have Dr. Rachael Gabriel joining us today. She's a professor at the UConn-Neag School of Education, and we are just so grateful. We met her at a conference a few years ago, and we're just grateful, thankful for all of her collegiality and support for the work that we do for our students, and we're really excited to present with her today. If you don't have her Readings Non-Negotiable book, you need to get it. It's really fantastic and important work to be happening in all of our schools. So here we go. Let's get rolling. So the work of social scientists, researchers, and other professionals in the real world is truly grounded in questioning and being curious human beings. Last year, we did a Paths of Inquiry conference at Fairfield University, and one professor who spoke called herself a detective of history, and another shared about how he started his research about mountaineering literature and wound up becoming an expert in Native American masculinity in literature. And it's just so interesting to see how people follow these paths of inquiry in the real world and do really important work. And make these huge contributions. So when we get our students to ask questions and encourage them to follow their own paths of inquiry, we're getting them to develop the skills and dispositions that are necessary for college and career, and it's more fun. We have a really good time with our students, and our students enjoy learning and coming to school every day. So our session today is going to focus on 4 principles that we have found to be really essential in the discipline-specific literacy and inquiry work that we do in our classrooms, and we're just really excited to share some of that with you today. So please tweet all of your good questions throughout the presentation, and most of all, our principles that we're talking about today are something that we consider a work in progress. We're always revising our ideas and thoughts and pearls of wisdom about what we see happening in classrooms. So if you have new ideas or things that you'd like for us to revise with some of these principles, add on, reflect on your learning today and share that with us so that you can be part of the collaboration as well. And we'd love to take that back to our work in our schools on Monday. So our 4 principles that we're going to talk about today are, the first one is all teachers are teachers of literacy in their disciplines. And Dr. Gabriel will talk a lot more about that today. She's going to share a little bit about some of those different messages that teachers have received over the years about their role as teachers of reading and writing, especially those content area teachers that have heard a lot of things and been included in a lot of things over the years. And doing really good work and digging into the work of real world jobs and thinking and dispositions and all those sorts of things are really important things to consider when we're thinking about literacy work with our students. Our second one is that everything is a text. This has been my mantra this year. Kids need to read the world around them. Text, art, photo, documentary, even artifacts are all things that we can read and we can think about using and applying all sorts of strategies to that work. The third one is that questions are quiet and loud. And we've been really exploring this. We often give a lot of attention to those kids that flag you down and raise their hands and demand a lot of attention. But we have a lot of kids that have really quiet questions, and we want to honor those and think about ways to structure our classrooms and our learning experiences for students so that we can honor those quiet questions too and find ways to give those kids that aren't necessarily putting those questions out there a voice in the classroom and in the conversation. And the last one seems very simple. Curiosity requires action to advance learning. But students really need to do real and meaningful work in order to grow as readers, writers, thinkers, and for me as a social studies coordinator, as citizens. And if we don't get them out there really taking action on the things that they're curious about and the questions that they're asking, then we're really not moving them forward in the skills that they need for the future. So it's a real important piece of the work that we do every day. All right, so I'm going to pass it off to Rachael now, and I will see you shortly. You're on,
Thanks,
Rachael.
Lauren. Hey. So thank you. Thanks for the lovely things you said in the beginning. So hi, I'm Rachael. I'm an assistant professor of reading education at UConn, and that means that I get to talk with a lot of secondary teachers about what reading and writing can look like in their classrooms. And most often I get pulled into those conversations by schools or by individual teachers because teachers are worried about students' literacy in their rooms. They're worried about them not being able to effectively understand the text that they put in front of them. They're worried about them not being able to effectively reflect how thoughtful and interested they are in their writing, because their writing doesn't match their oral language necessarily. And so I'm often in this position of trying to talk with content area teachers about what reading and writing could look like in their classrooms. And so I hear all of these different versions of possibilities. And this has been going on for a long time, but I think that since the Common Core State Standards included these other content areas in the whole idea that teachers have standards related to reading and writing in each of the content areas. And then in the last 4 or 5 years, each of the professional organizations for all of the different content areas, including things that you wouldn't necessarily expect, like music education, physical education, career and technology education, all of the standards of the different professional organizations are making much more explicit requirements for content area teachers to address the reading and writing that go with their content area. And this is good news because that means that there is some sort of coherence to the message that literacies are part of doing the discipline, that you aren't doing it if you aren't reading, writing, or talking about it. However, those of us who've been in education for more than a month have probably heard a mixed message about what that should look like. So I have on these little thought bubbles just a handful of the different messages that I've heard back from content area teachers about what they think that they should be doing, or what they think they are doing, or what an administrators ask them to do, whether that feels like it's a match for what they believe in or not. And you can see that they kind of range between saying, well, everybody is already a teacher of reading, so you must already be doing it like subliminally, to the idea that you really should, stop your lesson early, to leave some time at the end, to get on board with the team and help out with the reading and writing scores. And that really spans a pretty big spectrum of what we could be thinking about in terms of how teachers actually put literacy instruction into practice in a content area setting. It could be completely separate. It could be already part and parcel of what you're doing. It could be somewhere in between. And because there's so much talk about the idea that we should be supporting students as readers and writers across content areas, and so much talk about the idea that we also want to help them be disciplinary learners, that they know how to think like a historian or how to research like a scientist, that they know these discipline-specific practices and identities and mindsets. We have these big ideas that are easy to agree with, like our goals for our students as learners, but often it's not clear what practices actually line up behind those principles and make them a reality. And since there are these mixed messages, teachers try lots of different things, or are encouraged to try lots of different things that sometimes don't add up to making that principle a reality in their classroom. So if we can look at the very next slide, I have kind of a picture of the spectrum here. from a strategy orientation, which is one end of the spectrum, where we say, you know, if we help students be better readers and writers, then they'll do better in all of their content classes, and they'll learn all the content in a much more robust and independent way, and they'll be very engaged in it because they understand it, and then their own kind of curiosity can take it from there. And so at that far end of the spectrum, we think about just sort of making kids better general readers and writers and teaching generic reading strategies. And in the middle, there's this sort of compromise area where sometimes teachers receive messages that your content is important, but reading is also important. So can we think about how you could do a little bit of both? And this often looks like taking a reading practice that you might think of for language arts discipline and layering it on top of something like science. Like, we're going to read a novel about a scientist right before we study the concept that that scientist developed. So doing sort of both in tandem and in parallel. And there are some benefits to that and also some costs, because you are taking some space away from science to read about scientists in a format that is probably more associated with the kind of thinking, reading, and writing that you would see outside of the discipline of science. Not that it couldn't inform science, but if you have limited time to apprentice students into the practices of science as a community, there is a little bit of a risk attached to doing other things during that precious time. And so because of that little tension, the spectrum kind of keeps going all the way to the right, which is what I'm referring with my team of researchers to as a social practice orientation. And we got that term from Elizabeth Moji, who has written a lot about disciplinary literacy, a lot of brilliant things about disciplinary literacy that I think are really inspiring. But again, they make me wonder, I love this idea. How do I actually do it? Or how would I help teachers do it in their classrooms? So that other side of the spectrum is the idea that if you are doing the discipline, literacy was always already there. And doing the discipline is so interesting and engaging in itself, like actually being engaged in inquiry or in solving a problem or in building something, is so interesting in itself that it provides the motivation to do some pretty specialized and complex literacies, as long as teachers are aware of the support that they might need to give students in order to engage with them. So on this end of the spectrum, you might not see any reading strategy posters on the walls. And you might not see any classroom libraries in a math classroom, but you would see teachers teaching students how to read the text that go along with the disciplines that they're already doing. So if they are engaged in something that really is a mathematical practice, then they have scaffolding and strategies and explicit skills taught about how to read, write, and talk about those mathematical concepts. So we have this whole range, and that's exciting because we have lots of options, and there are pluses and minuses to wherever you might fall on a given day on the continuum. And probably expert teachers go back and forth and provide different kinds of literacy integration depending on what their students need. So there isn't like, we don't like the left side, we only like the right side. We probably need kind of all of this and all of this flexibility. But we still are kind of left with, what are the actual practices that make me live on one part of this spectrum? What are the actual practices that make me live out the principle that all text, everything is a text? Or what am I actually doing in my classroom if I want to live out the principle that all teachers are teachers of reading and writing in their disciplines? Not reading and writing in general, but the discipline-specific kinds of reading and writing that kids need to do to be actual doers of the discipline. So on the next slide, I stole an image from my favorite place, which is Google Images. And then I also stole an image from a recent-ish article from Elizabeth Moji in Harvard Education Review. So on one side of your screen, you see a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. And this is to signify that inquiry and literacy are pretty much like the peanut butter and the jelly in a PB&J. You can't really have one without the other, because literacy in its most basic form is meaning making, which is an inquiry process. What is here? What does it mean? And inquiry requires that we have a medium for inquiry, which is often but not always language, so reading, writing, or talking. So we have this idea that inquiry and literacy are really close together, but again, that's just a principle. What does that mean you do as a teacher in your classroom? And Elizabeth Moji, I think, is getting us closer to thinking about what are the actual teaching practices. If you see at the top, the teaching practices that go along with the disciplinary practices. So all disciplines are about producing knowledge and sharing that knowledge in some way. And so they kind of have this cycle of inquiry within them. And it looks slightly different because they're asking different sorts of questions about different phenomena, but they're all engaged in this sort of idea of inquiry. And if we want to teach students to also engage in inquiry that matches each discipline, then Moji says that there's basically, like, she calls them the 4 E's, 4 practices that we do flexibly and differently in different, in each of the different content areas. And if they're too small, I'll read them quickly. But we have this idea that you start by engaging, like you give students a reason to do something in the discipline. And then you do this eliciting and engineering, that manipulating the content, manipulating the ideas so that students understand what's there and what they can dig their teeth into. Then you have examining and evaluating. And if you're doing all of those things loosely, then you're doing sort of the literacy that comes with your discipline. But what I notice about all of these 4 things, evaluating, examining, eliciting, engaging, is those are all ways of asking questions. And they all require that questions be asked. And so if we want to get really specific about what teachers can do to support disciplinary literacy in their classrooms, we actually sort of have to start with questions, all different kinds of questions, questions at all different points in a lesson cycle, and questions at all different levels of curriculum planning. If we start with the questions, then we are engaging that meaning-making process at its starting point. And we can think about the texts, and everything's a text, that students need to engage with if they're going to be doing whatever you want them to do in class. And we can think about the skills and strategies they need to engage with that text effectively. So I'm going to turn it back over to my friends in Connecticut. And they're going to tell you a little bit more about these questions and how we decide on the questions and what we do with them once they come up in our lessons.
All right. Thank you, Rachel. Can everybody hear me? All right. So thank you. That is so such a wonderful way to start our session and really think about the link between literacy and inquiry and how important that is. So what I'd like you to look at that's on this slide right now is the Washington family portraits. We're going to do a little social studies strategy here, and you'll see the portrait. And if you are tweeting with us, and thank you, Chris Lehman and Aaron Shelby and Caroline and Patsy that I see tweeting with us. If you're out there and you haven't been tweeting at us yet, please join us. So, tell me a little bit about what makes you wonder. So, this is the Washington family. I'll talk to you a little bit more about what's happening here. But just, I'll take a minute and see if we have any tweets that are coming through with what people are noticing. So when we talk to students about looking at this image, and this is really starting with everything as a text and taking something, this is the original Facebook that people would have portraits painted of themselves. So they were sending messages and saying something about themselves and who they are through the art. So when we do this with students, students and also teachers in workshops, they notice things about Washington and that there are children and the pastoral landscape. They also notice a servant of sorts that's in the picture, and you start to put them into this wondering and questioning disposition. And one of the things that we really like to do is to use image as a text, use art, video, documentary, things like that before we engage kids with a reading task, because it really primes their brains to start thinking and wondering, and we can all wonder different things. So I'm seeing, on Twitter, where are they? What's happening here? So these are the types of questions that students ask about these people, and sometimes they don't have the background knowledge, and it also primes them to think about what they need to know going into looking at this image or digging in to the text. So someone is saying that they noticed, the young man close to George Washington, family relationships. Thanks, Chris Lehman. He's seeing race. He's seeing white people seated. Man standing in the back is not. So these are really important things. So if we could flip to the next slide, for the students, after kind of doing this, what makes you wonder? What we do is, this is where we can take a read aloud, and we don't do enough read aloud with our secondary students. I think it's really important to read aloud to them and really dig into small passages of text and really think about what we can wonder from even a really small passage. So Kenneth C. Davis just came out with a new book. It's called In the Shadow of Liberty. It is a young adult book, really for grades kind of 7 and 8 and up. And it's really beautifully done. And he starts the book with this Washington portrait. The image is in the book. And he asks this question in his first chapter: who is he? And he says, standing in the 1796 portrait of the Washington family is a house servant in uniform, a black man in profile, his features vague and shadowy. The other figures are clearly shown: President George Washington and his wife Martha, along with their grandchildren Nellie and Wash Custis. We know that the map on the table shows the site of the nation's future capital city. But who is the black man in the shadows? Nobody knows for sure. So now we add another layer of wondering, where kids have to really dig in to what the author is saying and how the author is using the text of an image to inform their writing and their research and what their interest is in this topic. Because Kenneth C. Davis is the question asker. He's the don't know much about history author, and he's all about questions. So what kinds of questions is the author asking, but what questions is the author asking us to ask as well? So this is really a great example of a historian engaging in inquiry and how he goes on to research something much more deeply. And what I love about this is that other historians might look at that painting and wonder different things. So real world social scientists ask questions and follow different paths, like detectives, like I mentioned earlier, and kind of the challenging skills of reading and writing become more manageable to differentiate here, because students can pursue a line of questioning using a range of materials and develop some unique conclusions. So, and sharing those conclusions really makes your classroom an exciting place. So if we flip to the other slide, I just have highlighted some things that you could be interested in. And, certainly Kenneth C. Davis was really interested in this house servant, this black man in the shadows. And his book really goes on to explore, the slaves that were held by many of the founding fathers and telling that story. But kids can ask questions within this about, the portrait itself, like what about the author? The Washington family, they want to know. Most people, when they look at this initially, think that the children in it are Washington's children, but we soon realize when we look at it that they're grandchildren. And so what do we not know about the story of the Washington family? So we could look at that. Martha is at the table. His wife is at the table with this map. What does that say about their relationship? What does that say about her? You might want to learn a little bit more about her. The map itself is something to think about, mapping out the nation's capital and what that really means. So this type of activity also brings up something really important that I like to talk about with teachers is, I call it challenging the narrative. So Ken Davis took this moment in American history that's being represented in a portrait and considers that there are different perspectives and other important messages that were coming through in that text. And so those quiet and loud questions that we were talking about really find a way to be honored here through using a visual and a text together to get kids thinking about a particular moment in history that they might typically study with a a pretty concrete narrative about the first president of the United States, or a traditional narrative. But the kids really think about what makes sense to them. So, if we scroll to the next slide, what I would really ask students to do is, I would say to them, Kenneth C. Davis chose to tell the story of the house servant in the shadows, which is a really, really important story to tell, particularly at this moment in American history, given what is happening right now. But for kids, it's, what story would you tell? Do you want to tell the same story? Or do you have other things? So we get kids really engaged in the inquiry process by thinking about all of these things. The year 1796 was important. I mean, we're seeing in this portrait as Washington leaving office, and we have the first contested U.S. election ever. So there's this important moment. Kids who are interested in art might want to really look into the artist who painted the portrait and what they were thinking. So there are a lot of things that kids can go in and explore and really bring together their work and engage with the discipline in a way that makes sense for them. And then, of course, that top layer of the graphic you see right now is more about, what are they going to do? They're going to engage in research skills. They're going to engage with nonfiction texts. They're going to look at primary documents. They're going to do the work of social scientists. So my last slide. Okay, so I'm on my last slide. Okay, great. So I think that it's just really important to think about the work that we do with kids and really engaging them like social scientists in the discipline. And I'm going to pass it off to Rebecca and Barb, and go back to Twitter and see if people have any other questions, because that was fast. Thanks.
Thanks, Lauren. I'm super excited to chat with you guys today about all the ways we can envision literacy being alive and well in the science classroom. As an English teacher and science literacy coach, I've had the opportunity to witness how challenging reading can be in the science classroom. But as Lauren was talking about, and Rachel as well, we really believe that all teachers are teachers of literacy. So we're going to talk a little bit today about the shift that we're trying to foster, from focusing on textbook reading to more authentic texts. So one of the things that we've been looking at is trying to talk a little bit about how we use inquiry to think like scientists, how scientists are searching out for answers to relevant questions. They're looking at current theory, they're asking why, and just this whole idea that, again, that literacy is alive and well in all classrooms, and not just in the English classroom, but that authentically scientists engage in inquiry work as well. So as I said, we've been trying to shift from just using the textbook, but also thinking about a variety of informational texts that connect to course content, and as well as incorporating other texts to read, such as film clips, and working from simply answering questions off of chapter reading to really becoming more active in their reading by doing things like text coding, annotating, and really asking those quiet questions that Lauren had talked about before to really foster inquiry and curiosity. And it's been very, very exciting, and what teachers are starting to see as we shift to this approach is that students are increasing their content knowledge. They're really excited about the work they're doing. So I feel really privileged to be part of that work in these classrooms. One of the things I want to talk about today is one strategy to use inquiry in the science classroom, which is the carousel discussion. Okay. Mm-hmm. So the way this was set up is that we had students, they all read an article about a recent breakthrough on research regarding finding a cure for cystic fibrosis. It was a really interesting article. Students read it, text coded for questions that they had, important parts that really stood out to them. And they came into, and they also marked application of their biological core concepts that they'd been studying. So when they came in, they were already like geared up and really excited to talk about the way that content they've been learning about was really alive in this pretty exciting article. And so students were then teaming up in groups, and they had to, although they didn't have a choice on the article that they read, they had a choice in terms of thinking about what parts really stood out to them. And ultimately they ended up picking a quote that from their small groups that really spoke to them and showed and depicted all the biological core concepts that they've been learning about. Then the kids were up at lab stations with chart paper and a little jigsaw. And this method is a variation off of a carousel technique that Nancy Steinecke and Harvey Daniels talks about in their text lesson text. So shout out to them. Check out their book if you haven't. And anyhow, so the kids were all in small groups at chart paper with markers. They were recording the critical passages that stood out to them. And then they started rotating around the room. And just in a nutshell, at each station, they would read the quote, then they would add their visual thinking. And so they had a lot of choice in their groups, and they kind of were taking like their quiet questions that they had recorded, and then they became like the loud questions that they were discussing. And it was really cool. I saw some kids drawing like DNA double helix. Some were asking questions like, what impact do biotech startup companies have on advancements in scientific, cures for disease? And the room was alive with chatter. There was definitely lots of inquiry, curiosity, and the kids, I think, were really excited to see that, what they'd been learning about in class, how it is authentically alive and well in the world today. So it was really, really fun to witness. And so the activity wrapped up after they'd cycled through like 6 or 7 stations. They had the like a synthesis challenge where they had to read over all the thinking that they saw on the chart paper and come up with a synthesis statement. They all shared out, and then a big discussion ensued. The last piece of their work was they then had to do some critical reflection and kind of score themselves on a rubric and thinking about kind of how they were able to use elaboration to support their thinking. And it was just really exciting.
Do you want the next slide?
Let's go to the next slide if we could. So there you can see the rubric that they used as they were wrapping up. And then they also gave us some feedback as well. So let's see. And then I guess just kind of wrapping up, this was one activity, but we're just, we're really excited as we're seeing more inquiry and curiosity in the science classes. I was listening to Rachael. I felt really inspired and was thinking about how this idea of like layered support is what we're starting to see happening more in our district, which is so great. For example, we have this new elective that's actually using the text Packing for Mars as like a framework for the whole class. So totally pumped about that. And just thanks for listening in today. I'm excited to see what we have going on Twitter. And I want to pass things over now to my partner in crime, literacy coach extraordinaire, Rebecca Marsick.
Hi, everyone. I can't believe how quickly it's going. I'm going to wrap up by talking a little bit more about social studies. As a literacy coach, I go into both English and social studies classrooms. And something that we talk about a lot is how students in all disciplines really need to continue working on their inquiry skills, regardless of grade level, regardless of ability. I am in classes, co-taught classes all the way through AP, and I see that this is a skill that all students really need to continue working on. The more complex the content and the text become, the more we need to have recursive teaching in this sense. And that's something that Carl Anderson talks a lot about with writing, but I think it's also very true in terms of teaching kids how to keep building their inquiry skills. So the focus on this presentation is social studies. And recently we were at a conference with a number of professors, and something that they spoke about a lot, which was really interesting, was how questioning drives their research and how every question they ask leads them to research. And then oftentimes once they start researching, they have new questions and they can go in an entirely different direction from where they originally thought they were going to go. And I think that's really important for students to know. is that the thesis isn't developed before you start writing the paper or before you start doing the research. The whole purpose of the research is to come to an understanding. And the way we guide our research is through questioning. And the way people in the real world guide research is through questioning. So social scientists have to think and work among many disciplines. And these are the disciplines just listed on the screen. So if you think about it, you know, kids have to constantly be thinking about geography and history and economics and all these different perspectives, and they're evaluating sources, and it's a lot for them to focus on. So we need to give them strategies for coming up with questions that are going to help them work among all these disciplines and really figure out how they want to guide their research. So one of the strategies that we've been using a lot is from the Right Question Institute. They have an incredible book called Make Just One Change that really outlines the protocol we're about to talk about in great detail. It's called the QFT, the Question Formulation Technique. And I just want to read a quick quote from page 12 of that book. They actually quote Robert J. Sternberg, who said, "Children are natural question askers. They have to learn how to adapt to a complex and changing environment. But whether they continue to ask questions depends in large part on how adults respond to them." And I think that's the main key, is that we need to respond to kids' questions in a way that encourages them to continue questioning. And the best way to do that is to incorporate it into our curriculum and really try and build our curriculum around students' questions, because that's engagement and that's also helping to promote choice in their learning. So the QFT does just that. The way the protocol works is that you pose a statement to students, and it can be any statement. I'll show you a few examples in a minute. They have to ask as many questions as they can. They're working in groups. And this first part is really about those quiet questions that Lauren talked about. So they're writing on a big piece of chart paper just all the questions they can think of. They can't stop to judge or answer any of the questions or discuss them. They have to write down every statement, every question exactly as it's stated, and then change any statement into a question. And we always ask students, you know, what challenges do you foresee in trying to follow these rules? So if you want to just take quick few seconds to tweet, do you see any challenges in following these rules? Some of the things that are often stated by kids, usually when I ask what challenges, they're just crickets. But then they eventually will start talking about how they think, what if we don't have any questions? And that's the thing that's so hard for me as an educator, is I've been in elementary classrooms where kids are filled with questions, and then you get to secondary, and oftentimes students just stop asking questions for social reasons, because they've been trained to think that there's a right answer. So we really want to encourage students across grade levels to ask questions. They have a hard time not judging, not discussing, not answering. So there are a number of things that are challenging in this strategy, but also really, really important for them to practice. So once they ask questions, then we work on categorizing the questions into closed and open-ended questions. They choose their top 3 questions and prioritize them, and then reflect on why they chose these questions. So we'll build an entire class list of questions, and that drives the instruction for that research or for the book club or whatever it is that might be happening. So a couple examples, we'll go to the next slide. The modern world is more defined by conflict than collaboration. This was a question that we posed in a modern issues class. And you can see there's 2 different ways that students are responding to that initial point. Sometimes they like to all write their own questions because they're not comfortable sharing them, or they just want to brainstorm on their own first, and you can see that on the left-hand side. And then on the other side, you can see this was a group that decided to do all of their questioning together. So they threw out questions and one person was the recorder. Either way works. It just depends on the dynamic of the group. Then we talked about open and closed questions, and these are, I had recorded this from a group of 9th graders. We talked about advantages and disadvantages of open and closed, because it's really important to tell them that oftentimes they think closed questions aren't good, but there's a purpose for closed questions. They help us with facts. They oftentimes help us build the groundwork to ask the open-ended question. So it's important for them to use both kinds of questions. But the really important part is that they recognize which kinds of questions they're asking. So these were some questions on the next slide that students came up with from that initial statement about the modern world is more defined by conflict than collaboration. And these were just basic questions from the very beginning. Who's collaborating, what conflicts, and what parts of the world? If so, why do we always hear more about conflict than collaboration? And through these, you can also get a sense of what they already know. So you're getting a sense of students' background knowledge, you're getting a sense of what kinds of materials you need to bring in based on the questions. Someone's asking the QFT protocol. It comes from Ask Just One Question. So, and we'll post that too. So then this next slide is also different questions that students asked about imperialism has impacted, and then insert your country. So a global themes class was studying imperialism across South Africa, India, and China. Different groups had different countries. The same statement was posed, but all of the students in the different groups just asked different questions about their specific country. But what was really interesting about this is they did it at the beginning, then they researched, then they came back and did another QFT. So if you look at the next slide, you'll see the shift in their questioning. So from round one, they started with questions like, how did imperialism affect China? After they did some research, they started thinking about, okay, what were some of the motives to imperialize China? How has China's political structure been affected by imperialism? So they were digging deeper and getting more specific, and you can see that that's building on their knowledge based on their research. So the next thing that they did is they built a wonder wall in the classroom so that as the research process continued, students could keep asking questions now that they knew the kinds of questions and had developed those techniques. And each day they would go to the wonder wall and they would look at what different classes had been doing. Because this was across, I think, 5 different classes. There was one wonder wall. So everyone who was researching China from 5 different classes, all those kids could have an even broader audience, an even broader base of gathering questions and research information. They would share texts that they had found, and they would share questioning and research, and it was really a very collaborative experience for them. So something that just I think is really important about the literacy strategies involved with the QFT are that it really helps to ignite background knowledge. So you help kids think about what they already know. It also helps fill in gaps for teachers as to what content needs to be taught. It helps to front load the content because as students are working in groups, they're learning from each other. Even through asking questions, they're learning a lot about the content. It helps students to establish purpose in their reading and research, which is so important. So they're not just entering a topic, cold. They've already established a purpose for what they're trying to look for, and it gives them ownership of their learning. So if everyone has to learn about imperialism, they have choice in that because they're asking the questions to drive their research. So we really, really love this protocol, and we say, go out, buy the book. It's called Make Just One Change, and it's the Right Question Institute. So Rachel is just going to do a quick reflection on our 4 principles.
There they are. There they are. All right. So to close us off, we have less than 5 minutes left. We started with this idea that all teachers are teachers of literacy in their disciplines, but that can and should look different depending on the discipline and depending on what it means to be truly engaged in doing the content, not just doing the reading and writing that we do for school, but doing the reading, writing, and talking that we do on our way to doing these disciplinary practices. And one of the ways that we can put ourselves into the middle of that big idea is by asking questions and encouraging students to ask questions, because inquiry is at the heart of doing all of the academic disciplines that we offer students in middle and high school and high school currently. And probably at the heart of most disciplines, because again, disciplines only exist as communities to generate and share knowledge. And if we're generating and sharing knowledge, then we're probably engaged in some sort of inquiry process at some point. So questioning is at the heart of doing the discipline, and questioning often leads us to need language, either oral language, written language, or texts of other that are not language based, like some of the images and videos, and if you're in science, just sort of reading the text of the apparatus in front of you or the text of the environment in front of you. And so if we want students to be engaged with questions, then we have to think about making room for the loud questions that kids shoot up their hands to ask, and also the quiet questions that they have in the back of their minds, because those might be the ones that are most closely aligned to the discipline and that are most worth exploring. And so we have to leave room for kids to come up with them and also share those quieter questions along with the loud ones that we don't have to worry about because they're already loud. And then we have as our last principle, this idea that curiosity requires action. So we can't just sit around wondering these questions. We have to do something about it. And often in the context of an academic discipline, what we do is we read, write, or talk about it. And we have a broad definition of reading and writing, which isn't necessarily words, right? But we create meaning or we find meaning in the text that surround us. So if we stick with these 4 principles, they need practices behind them if we're going to actually live them out. And those practices most often start with questions.
And our final piece is just a quick plug for, if you want to know more, you can pick up Rachel's book, Reading Non-Negotiables, and Lauren and my book, Stretching Beyond the Textbook, to talk more about inquiry and book clubs. And then these are our Twitter handles. Please follow us. Thank you so much for participating in our institute. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone. Send us questions on Twitter and we'll answer them.
All right, ladies, thank you so much. That was a great session. I'm excited to bring it back to my district. Great thinking around questioning and bringing that into the various disciplines. Awesome work. So right now, we're wrapping up session 2, and we will be on next with session 3. We have coming up workshop number 10, Chris Lehman, just going over some professional learning that is available. And then we also have session 12, where it's a choice as the keystone in secondary English classes. We also have another session, session 11. Oh, I'm sorry, I skipped around, but session 11 will be Mary Howard and Linda Hoyt, maximizing deep thinking and reflection through independent reading and read aloud. And workshop number 13, Institute of Play plus Quest, to learn game-based teaching strategies for the student-centered classroom. So tune in, and we'll see you at 1 o'clock. Take care.